Hello and welcome back to the Human Anatomy and Physiology Lab. This is Mrs. Popplewell, and today we're going to look at the human skull. We're going to look at the anterior bones and then look at the lateral bones. Most of the bones of the skull are considered flat bone by classification, with some irregular bones. Most of the facial bones are considered irregular bones. The anterior view of the skull, the anterior bones, if you place your hand right above the orbit, which is the eye socket, and lay your hand down like this, you would have your hand on the frontal bone. Then the parietal bone would be right behind that. So parietal bone, and there are actually two, it's a bilateral, there are two parietal bones. A frontal bone, a parietal bone. The frontal and the parietal bones are separated by a suture line that has the same name as the plane that divided the body into anterior and posterior parts. That coronal suture separates the frontal from the parietal bones. The coronal suture. Now, lacrimal means tear, and right here you would see the lacrimal bone. It's right inside the orbit, and there is a foramen or little hole there where the lacrimal gland releases tears, but this is the lacrimal bone. The ethmoid bone would be also in that orbit right above it, the lacrimal bone. Okay, now with the lateral view, the area, this is where the ear would be, and we'll name this in just a minute, but this is the temporal bone. Okay, we're going to skip down and name the lower jaw, which is the mandible. The bridge of the nose is called the nasal bone. Now, this is what my glasses were sitting on. This part of the nose is hyaline cartilage. That's why it's a little bit flexible. This part is bone. This is the nasal bone. Okay, this part is a facial bone, considered an irregular bone. This is the zygomatic bone. Now, if you look right below the nasal bone and the nasal cavity, you'll find these curled up bones. The curled bones is called the Nasal Conca. Now, this is the inferior nasal concha in particular, right here, and that bone sort of curls up like this, the concha. The CH in that word is pronounced like K. Now, on the lateral view, here are the parietal bones, and the squamosal suture is right here. It is a suture line. Now, this is a type of joint that fuses in the development of the fetus in the womb, and you know, before this area fuses, that is called the fontanelle in a baby, and the fontanelle usually closes by age 5 to 6. Okay, but this line here is called the squamosal suture. The squamosal suture separates the parietal bone from the temporal bone, the area around the ear, the temporal bone. Now, more posterior would be the occipital bone, the occipital. The occipital bone is separated from the temporal bone and the parietal bone by this suture line, and this suture line goes all the way down here, and that suture line is called the lambdoid suture. Lambdoid suture. And the hole here in the temporal bone, the external acoustic meatus. A meatus is an opening that tubes the hearing apparatus follows through here, the auditory passageway here where the ear would be. That is the external acoustic meatus. So I'm going to go over those first bones in figure 14.2 again for you in order of your lab manual. Okay, number 1 in your lab manual was the parietal bone. And then number 2, the squamous suture. The squamous suture separates the temporal from the parietal. And then the lambdoid suture separates the occipital from the temporal from the parietal. So the lambdoid suture, this is the temporal bone. The occipital bone is posterior, the posterior skull. And right there in the temporal bone would be the external acoustic meatus. Then the coronal suture again, the frontal bone. Again, the ethmoid bone is right there. Skip down to the zygomatic bone. The upper teeth are in the maxilla. And of course, this would be the mandible. Now let's look at the posterior view. And we're going to remove the mandible for just a minute to look at this, so it's more easily seen. Here is the temporal bone right here. So the mandible actually articulates on part of the temporal bone. This area right here is all the temporal bone. The maxilla, where the teeth are. The zygomatic. This very large opening here, the foramen magnum, or magnum foramen, depending on what book you're looking at, determines what order that is placed in. Foramen magnum. A foramen, again, is a hole, usually larger than a meatus. And magnum means large, so large opening or large hole, foramen magnum. And then this would be the occipital. Okay, let's take the cranial cap off and look at the inside features of the floor of the cranial cavity. The ethmoid bone would be here. This would be frontal. But right here in the center area would be the ethmoid bone. Get a little closer. So you have this part of the ethmoid bone that goes through the middle of the nasal cavity, and it actually protrudes slightly up into the cranial cavity. And so it's continuous. That ethmoid bone is continuous all the way up into the cranial cavity. This butterfly-shaped area is called the sphenoid bone. Here is the temporal bone. And there is, if you follow through, there's that external acoustic meatus. And right here, though, in that butterfly shape, would be the sphenoid, and then the temporal, and then back here the occipital. Okay, the occipital. And I want to talk a little bit about this area that's in the center of the sphenoid. Now, we're going to be looking at the parts of the brain a little bit later on, but the posterior inferior brain has a stalk that holds the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland sits in this area called the sella turcica. Sounds like the latest model of a Toyota, the sella turcica. The sella turcica, this bone sort of comes up and over just a little bit. When we, in the A&P labs, dissect a sheep's brain, we try to order the sheep's brain with the pituitary gland still attached, but we have to pay a little bit more for those because when they're removing the brain, a lot of times that pituitary gland will remain in the sella turcica because it sort of comes up and around just slightly to protect that pituitary gland. The sella turcica. Now the largest hole in the skull is going to be the foramen magnum. It is not the largest foramen in the body, but it is the largest one in the skull. Okay. Now, this is the frontal bone in this area. If we did a cutaway, then we could see the frontal sinuses. In this area, we could see the maxillary sinuses. But we don't have a skull right now that shows that, but the sinuses would be a cavity here. It is like spongy bone, and a cavity there with like spongy bone that are the sinuses, the frontal sinuses, and the maxillary sinuses.